Hello, welcome to the SciPhi show, and today we're going to be discussing famine, affluence, and morality. Yes, indeed. So, this is going to be hopefully an interesting conversation, and it's one of those ones that Dave is looking forward to doing. It's something he studied at university, and he managed to get a distinction in it. So we should have a fair understanding of the topic, or at least he should, even if Philip and I don't. So it's along the lines of, if you imagine that you're on your way to work and you see a child drowning in the shallow end of a pond. All it will take to save them is a wade in to pull them out. It will mean that you destroy your new shoes and your jeans will get wet, but do you have an obligation to pull the jeans out? To pull the child out. And this is what Peter Singer asks us in his 1972 paper, Famine, Affluence and Morality. So that's today's stream. Hopefully you'll stick around and enjoy it with us. So welcome to the SciPhi show. I'm Joe.
I'm Dave.
And I'm Philip.
And it's been a while since we've seen you, Philip.
It's been a while.
Yeah,
indeed.
good to see you back.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy, always happy to be here and discuss things with you. It's always a pleasure.
Do you want to let people know what you've been doing, or are you going to keep that sequel squirrel? Sequel squirrel?
No,
Secret squirrel. I cannot speak tonight.
Vacation of various sorts, and I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. And Dave, I obviously gave a quick intro to what we're going on about tonight, but do you want to give us a bit more of a rundown?
Yeah, no worries. So tonight we're going to be discussing Peter Singer's Famine, Affluence and Morality, a paper that he originally published in 1972 in Philosophy and Public Affairs, I think it was. It's a pretty short paper, about 16 pages long, which, for a philosophy paper, that's pretty much a pamphlet. And it discusses our obligations to the distant poor. And it's a pretty seminal paper. It's studied in most undergrad programs, and even in master's programs, you go deeper into it and you learn all the various responses to it. And it made a bit of a stir when it was released. It was the first time in a very long time that people had addressed things like poverty in distant lands and things like that. And it still kind of makes waves today. One of the things that gets people kind of riled up about it is the argument that he makes basically says that everyone who lives in the Western world is immoral. Like everybody, pretty much.
Even those living on the street.
No, but any person who is above the poverty line in a Western country or in an affluent country is immoral. And he kind of gets this from. Sorry, I can't scratch my head because of these damn headphones. He makes this assumption that if you're reading this paper, you probably live in the Western world, you probably live in an affluent country, and you probably have not just spare money, but money that you spend on luxuries.
Right.
And this argument says that if you have extra money and you don't give it away, you're immoral. And if you buy luxuries unnecessarily, well, I suppose all luxuries are unnecessary, I guess, just by the definition of the term. But if you spend money on stuff you don't need instead of giving it to the poor, you're immoral. So that caused a pretty big stink because being told that you're immoral is kind of a kick in the teeth, really, isn't it? Especially when you consider yourself a good person and you probably lead a pretty good life, dropping a few pennies into, a charity box. You're going to get kind of offended by that. And that's what a lot of the responses kind of got.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, does it matter how close you are to that poverty line as well? If you're simply, just over it, and if you were to, I don't know, you could afford, £7 a month for Disney Plus, and that gives you your watching. Are you immoral for spending that £7? Oh, have we lost Dave?
We lost Dave. Yeah.
It does say that his connection's really poor at this end.
Yeah, he's back now.
He is.
Yeah, sorry, I'm back now. I've just unplugged the Alexa just in case it was interfering with the wireless signal.
There.
So
yes, what I was saying there, Dave, was
I it caught up at the end.
Okay.
He would say that no, you're not being immoral because he does make allowances for certain things. And if you're on the streets and I suppose you wouldn't be homeless and having Disney Plus, but if that's the only luxury you have and you needed to get by, then perhaps you could get away with it. But the stronger version of his argument would be that no, you're still being immoral. As long as you have food, shelter, medical care, that's it. That's all you really need.
At least while there's other people out there that don't have that.
That don't have it. Yeah.
So, I mean, if all things were equal, then obviously that wouldn't be the case. It would be a different state of affairs.
Yeah.
If everyone had Disney Plus, then I don't think it would be an issue for you to have Disney Plus.
No. But if everybody had Disney Plus, then there would be no people starving. So
yeah, that's also correct, I suppose. Yeah.
To be fair, I think you only need 1 in 5 people to have Disney Plus, don't you? You can share it at 5 different locations at once. So
we solved it immediately.
Sorry.
What
Philip.
I wanted to ask, Dave, is, and this is something. Maybe this is opening up a huge discussion. I don't know, right? But the idea of what you really need, right, is really something that a bit of is slippery in my mind, right? Because it's very easy to imagine, right? Like if you go back 2,000 years or something, right, or even further back, right? Technically, there's like very, very few things that you actually really need, right, to be able to survive. You don't even need a home. You don't need, like, arguably, you don't even need healthcare in like generally speaking, unless you're in a situation really that requires it, right? There are like very few things that you actually need. So like need is a bit of a slippery word in my opinion, right? Because of course someone could use the same word to argue that, like, need sort of a shelter, right? Somewhere where you sleep every night and stuff like that, right? So that would be sort of my first question, I suppose, like if that's a problem or if you see it as a problem.
It's not. I think what Singer would answer here is that in the modern society that we live in, you need a home. Because most of your correspondence would go there. Most companies won't hire a homeless person. You need a home to store your clothes so that you can go out and go to work, have shower, a safe place, because that's one of the things that Singer argues, that suffering because of homelessness is a very bad thing. So having a home is something that's not wrong to have. But if you're a single person who lives in a $6 million home when you could get by in a $150,000 home, then maybe you're being a bit immoral. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I suppose like a follow-up to that would be, does Singer see it as a problem, right? Like if you're suffering, right? Suppose that the world is such that like everyone is suffering, right? Like let's just imagine that, right? Everyone is in a shitty situation and not really enjoying themselves. But there are some people that are in a worse situation than others, right? Would then in this situation, according to Singer, like would this sort of apply in a way where the people who feel like shit, right, but but less like shit than other people, would they have sort of a moral obligation to raise the bar for everyone?
No, I would think in a situation like that, Singer would argue that it's supererogatory. In other words, it's something, something you're not obliged to do, but it's a good thing for you to do.
I see.
Because if you don't have the extra to give to them, then giving to them is a good thing. But if you have the extra that'll stop them starving and suffering, then maybe. This paper is basically aimed at affluent countries only. Only those people with that kind of affluence fall under under prey of this argument.
I'm sorry, I don't want to hijack the whole conversation.
No, don't worry.
Wait, I think I lost my train. Yeah, exactly. Like how this is a question I think that is in general present in ethics, not just in this particular situation, but this is a relevant question anyway, right? We seem to have like this distinction between things that you are virtuous if you do these things, but it's not like you're immoral if you don't do these things, right? That's one category. And then there's another category where if you don't do these things, then you're straight up immoral, right? So the sort of dividing line between these is a sort of open ethical question, I think, broadly speaking, right? But does Singer offer any sort of ideas or any way to distinguish these two categories, right? Like in terms of what would you just be considered virtuous and what would be considered immoral if not sort of done?
He kind of does. In this paper, though, it's kind of drawn at if you can stop somebody from suffering without any real sort of moral trade-off. So saving the boy drowning in the pond is not moral if you need to step on another child who drowns.
Yeah.
So if there's a moral trade-off that's greater than the actual action that you're supposed to do, then you're not obliged to do it. But in the case of something like this, you are morally obliged because I'll explain it in more detail when I go into the actual argument paper.
No worries. Maybe we should get into that because I think I'm also sort of like I have an idea of what the argument is, so maybe we should get into that first, and then we can.
No worries.
The whole thing. Yeah.
Well, before we do, Claire has just said, I do recall polls of charitable giving showing a very disturbing trend that those with less give more statistically. And I can actually imagine that being true. Because I think people who have less tend to understand what it's like to have less.
They know what it's like to suffer and not have, so they don't want other people to go through that.
Exactly.
And this is also kind of ratio wise. What they mean by giving less is they might be giving substantially more money, like $100,000, and you only give, say,
but in proportion to their overall wealth.
Yeah, they give like a fraction that's meaningless to them, even though it's £100,000 or dollars.
It's like that the biblical story that was brought up in one of our responses to 10 question streams. You know, the story of the silver coin, the woman that gave her only silver coin versus the people who might have given 10 but they had hundreds, and so that one silver coin that she gave was worth so much more. And I do think that you can sometimes have a bit more empathy when you have experienced poverty more, or you think about it. If you've ever been a waiter, there's a good chance that you're going to treat your wait staff better because you know what the dickhead customers are like. If you've ever worked on the trolleys, there's a good chance that you're going to put your trolley back, and maybe even if you see another one lying there on the way to put your trolley back, you're going to get it. Whereas someone who's never done that might not actually give a fuck. You know, someone else can do it. And I think this is part of the problem we might actually have from if we were to judge morality purely by empathy alone, is the fact that we don't have the wealth of experience to give us the empathy for everyone in every situation.
Yeah.
I do think that.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I know that's a little bit off topic, but
No, I think that's actually very, very important. But I think that's definitely like a factor. But I also think maybe there's this sort of psychological factor, because the majority of the population, right, deems, say, $1 million, right? $1 million is a lot of money for the majority of people, right? And $1 million appears to be a lot of money to the vast majority of people. And I think sort of there's this cultural sort of phenomenon where people think of $1 million as being a whole, like a boatload of money, right? Even though to a very few select individuals, that might be less than like $5 to someone that has.
It's kind of like change that they find down the back of the sofa.
Yeah, exactly, right. But because to the majority of people that appears to be a lot of money, there's sort of, I think, this psychological trend that maybe is not even conscious, even individuals that have a lot, where they feel like they're giving a ton of money when they give $1 million, even though to them that is not as much, right? But because there's this sort of undertone where everyone deems $1 million to be a lot of money, maybe that's sort of something that plays into it as well. And also, like, I think there's sort of this social pressure factor as well, in terms of like just I mean, this might get a bit off topic, right? But I think like a lot of maybe wealthy individuals donate and do stuff. Maybe like this is particularly pronounced in wealthy individuals, but I think it could be true even for other people, right? But there's sort of like this image status to donating, right? You do it because it affords you like a better public image, right? It feels good because other people say how good you are and stuff like that, right? So because this $1 million is a lot of money to a lot of people, you can sort of buy this sort of good feeling, right, for less, essentially, in proportion, right? Because you can give this, and for a ton of people that's going to be a lot of money, and everyone you're going to get the praise, essentially, even though you're spending proportionally less than someone who has less money. And I'm not trying to make a point about this being like something that people are calculating in their head. This could be, it's perfectly plausible in my opinion. This is just like sort of an undertone.
I think there's somebody knocking at the door.
Okay.
Oh God! I've just had my computer.
Wait, at both?
No. I just had something go wrong on my computer.
Oh, okay. I hope it's not too bad.
No. I've got a plug which I use to automatically switch things off, and yeah, it's basically just reset everything on the stream, so it's probably gone black for everyone, and we should be back. So sorry about that, everybody. A random little dark spot in the middle of the stream. That's all right.
Sorry about that. Emma's key got jammed in the door when trying to get in, so she had to knock to get me to go down.
No worries. So yeah, but basically, I was done anyway with my point, right? I was just sort of making these maybe also reasons why this sort of discrepancy exists.
No, I totally agree with what you're saying, because if you, like you say, if a poor person hears he gave £1 million, it does sound like a lot. And generally, when we think about monetary value, we don't think of it in proportions, unless it's us spending it.
Yeah.
Oh, so so where were we, Dave? We were going to go into the paper a little bit.
Yeah.
Too many distractions in my mind right now.
I can relate to that. That's basically my brain all day.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, when Singer wrote this paper, the Bengali famine was going on, and there was a lot of people starving and suffering and dying. And when he looked around there was the Concorde going on, and that was being designed and built. And the amount of money they spent on that could have saved millions of lives. And I think the Sydney Opera House was being built at the time, and he said, there's no real moral trade-off if they'd have not built the Sydney Opera House or the Concorde. But by not giving it to them, they allowed something morally despicable to happen, which is millions of children and adults dying from starvation. And so that's what he kind of argues in this paper. If you have money, and you're spending it on things that you don't need, or, there's no real moral reason to have the Sydney Opera House over saving millions of lives. If you have that kind of money, you should be saving people rather than building architecture and whatnot.
Yeah, fair. That makes sense.
Sorry, I ran down the stairs and then back up again, so I'm a bit. Yeah.
I can't imagine you running, Dave.
Neither can I. Hence the out of breath, No. So his argument basically begins with, like I put in the description, you're on your way to work, and as you pass by a pond, you see a small child drowning in it. If you can just step in and pick up the child, it means I added the destroy your shoes for a particular reason, which I'll bring about in a bit. But his argument is just that your clothes will get muddy. Do you have a moral obligation to pull that child out?
Well, yeah. I think all of us would say that.
It's incredibly strong intuition to say yes.
It really is, isn't it?
And I think we'd be quite surprised if anyone turned around and went, well, no, why would I be obligated to do so?
Yeah. I think that would sort of raise a lot of red flags, right? In most people's minds. Yeah.
I mean, if you got into work and you said, sorry, I'm 15 minutes late, but I saw a child drowning,
your boss went, that's
so I pulled them out. Well, most bosses and most people would go, that's all right, don't worry about it, you did a good thing. But if you'd have got to work and said, I thought I was going to be late because I saw this child drowning, but I thought, no, I don't have time, I'm going to be late, so I came in. Most of your bosses would look at you like you're a freaking psychopath.
Yeah.
So there seems to be this intuition that, we are obliged to help a child who is about to drown. Now, what if you're too far away to reach him, or you're not right by the thing, but you're far enough away where you'll have to run to save him? Does that add any weight to your to not being obliged? Of course not, because what's a 100-meter sprint? Unless you're me, and then you get 20 yards and have a heart attack. But no, it still wouldn't stop the obligation. Now, what if you're so far away that you probably won't get there, but if you throw a life ring to somebody else, who then throws it to somebody else, who then throws a child, you'll be saved at this life ring? Do you have the obligation to throw it to the next person? You'd probably say yes, because, it's no skin off your nose to check this thing. So it doesn't seem to be that proximity matters either. Like, you don't have to be right next to the person to save them. There seems to be this obligation where if you're too far to do something directly, but you can do something, you're obliged to do it. So would you agree with that one?
Yep.
Yeah.
I can see where this is going.
Yeah. So now imagine there's 10 people around you. Do you lose any of that obligation to help the child because there are other people that could do something?
No, you've all got the obligation.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what Singer would argue. So it doesn't seem to be proximity that changes anything about your obligation. The number of people that could do something doesn't change your obligation. Now, what if instead of just getting muddy, you would actually destroy the shoes that you're wearing? You have another pair of shoes at home that are perfectly good. They're tatty. They're not the newest fashion. But, they'll do. So, do you still have an obligation even though you will lose a pair of shoes?
Yeah. I'd say a life is worth more than a pair of shoes.
And they're not morally comparable. Losing a pair of shoes isn't morally comparable to a mother losing their child. So these are sort of the groundings that Singer works from. Proximity doesn't matter. The number of people around you that could do something doesn't matter. You still have an obligation to try. And all this seems to be that 100 years ago, proximity and kind of number of people might have made a difference, because 100 years ago, you didn't have instant access to what was going on the other side of the world. And 100 years ago, you also didn't have charities that were worldwide, that had headquarters, donation boxes in every shop. So it doesn't seem to be any of that makes a difference. So if you're obliged to save the child by losing a pair of shoes, what about if you're going to spend £70 on a new pair of shoes, but there's a child dying of starvation in some other country? Do you then have to give that money and give up the new pair of shoes and just wear your old tatty ones?
If the old tatty ones are functional, I suppose it depends. Like if they were a pair of work shoes and you weren't allowed to wear tatty shoes to work.
Singer makes allowances for
that. Yeah, no, but that's what I'm saying. Yeah. I'm if there is no reason to use this pair, to need a brand new pair of shoes, or to need the most expensive new pair of shoes, then I'd agree with you.
Sorry, was just filling up the vape pen. So that's kind of what Singer's arguing here, that, if you're obliged to lose the pair of shoes to save the child, then what is the difference between having to give up buying a pair of shoes and giving to charity to stop a child from drowning in starvation halfway across the world and the child in the pond?
Yeah. I suppose ultimately there isn't a massive difference. I think one of the problems I guess you could have is you don't always know where the money from charities is necessarily going. It doesn't always seem to go to the child. If there was a way to give to the people that actually need it and ensure that they actually need it, then you definitely have a strong point.
That's one of the points in effective altruism, though, that a part of being moral and giving to charity is to understand where the money goes within that charity. You should be researching those topics beforehand, before giving to the charity, to make sure your money is being used most effectively.
I'd agree, but what if you discover that there isn't really any charity that's doing at least how you conclude is the most effective way to, spend the money?
Then you would have to give to the one that probably just you seem to think does the most good work. As long as you think it does the most good work, there's a bit of leeway there.
And how do you weight what sort of charity is the most good work? What's the difference between, say, let's just say you had cancer research and you had, people starving.
If there's millions of people dying across the world, that is the charity you should be giving to, because they're the ones saving the most lives immediately.
Yeah, I also think, I think it might be useful to separate sort of a hypothetical scenario and a practical, and then sort of argue whether or not that hypothetical scenario commits you to anything in the real world, right? For instance, you could imagine quite easily, let's just suppose that there is a charity that gives the money directly to the people, and the people directly need it, to the point where there is this sort of direct relationship where you give the money and you save at least one life, let's say, and you have figured everything out, everything is transparent, you can see how this connection works and is there, right? Then I think it becomes obvious, right, that that you should do that, right? Probably, at least the intuition seems to be very strong there. And then, of course, once you agree with the hypothetical scenario, right, then it's sort of like an open question, or a different question, I suppose, whether or not such a scenario is or exists actually in the real world, so that you can sort of be committed to that because you're committed to the hypothetical. If there is sort of a mirror example there, and if there is not a mirror example that is as clear, right, it could be an interesting open question then, how much does opaqueness in the process sort of relieve you from the obligation, right? Like, and how much percentage of opaqueness can you tolerate before sort of that thing goes away and stuff like that, right? I think that could be another option.
Those are there's a philosopher called Thomas Pogge, and he was a student of Peter Singer's, and he goes on to discuss a bunch of this stuff. We should probably do a stream on that in the future.
Yeah, that would be absolutely fascinating, yeah.
But generally, there has to be some kind of openness about the charity. If a charity says, we don't show anybody our books, but trust us, we're doing a good job, that should probably be discarded. If there's a reasonable amount of opaqueness where you can tell that there is something good going on, even though you don't know how much the CEO is earning out of the money you donate, you can probably donate to that one because it is still doing some good. But when you know something is doing better, you should probably go with that one and go with that one. You have a moral obligation to make sure your money is doing the best. That's a sort of consequentialist. Peter Singer is a consequentialist and a utilitarian, so that's how he looks at it.
Yeah, that's fair. A couple of comments from the chat before we go on. Daniel Kelly says, I mainly think the argument fails economically. We have to ask how someone got so rich and so poor in the first place. Until that is solved, you're putting plaster on a gaping wound. I mean, I don't disagree, but...
that's something we'll be covering shortly, because that's one of John Keek's arguments. I
disagree, though.
Bodin.
Like, I tend to disagree because, sure, these seem to be parallel sort of ideas to me, right? You can ask yourself how we got to this situation, and you can try to fix the system sort of from the ground up, right, from the beginning, and try to do sort of a more radical reworking of the entire thing, right? But I don't think that relieves you from the obligation that you have right now, given the current situation, right? That would be sort of my intuition there.
Yeah, that'd be my intuition as well. But simply throwing money at it is only a part of what should be happening. I sort of take Keek's argument and Bodin's argument that if you just keep throwing money at it, it'll cause greater problems eventually. What you need to do is work on solving the structural problems within that society, as well as making sure that people don't starve to death.
Yeah, I think that seems very reasonable to me.
Jeff also says there's arguments I hear from some Marxists I know about these arguments about people who are big philanthropists, but when you look at the way they made their money in the first place, it's problematic. And you do find a lot of that, don't you?
Yeah, I think like we could talk about capitalism a whole lot. Yeah, I think there's definitely some interesting things there about the ethics.
I mean, perhaps the giving away of the money is the redemption part of their character arc. You know, they've come to the conclusion that they've caused all this damage, and this money is supposed to help repair some of the problems that they've created. Yeah.
I think like there's also like, I don't know. I think the way the system is set up, it also doesn't make it's I want to say it's more like a fault of the system than it is a fault of the individual, almost, right? Like the way it is set up. At least I know it's not a perfect thing, right?
No. Yeah.
I think the system contributes a lot to the also like psychological influence it has on the individuals that are part of it, and you're sort of like in this mindset that this is the race that you're in, or this is the system you're in, and that sort of affects the decisions you make as well. So I think part of that, I think, is attributable to
that. Daniel also says, I work in debt advice and UK poverty relief, and it's all about the distribution. Charitable relief does not work well, unfortunately. I think that there is something to be said for that. I think there's a lot of problems within charities because, unfortunately, charities are sometimes run far too much like businesses these days. And, I understand they need to keep their own costs going. Sorry, Dave, you cut out there.
Oh, no, sorry, go on.
No, go for it.
I volunteered at the BHF for a while, and I know that these are run like businesses. Like the managers of the shops will get bonuses for shifting as much stuff as possible.
Yeah.
So in Peter Singer's argument, that charity isn't really being particularly effective because that luxury that they gave to that person who probably doesn't necessarily need the money if they're getting a living wage could have been spent on helping the poor or the people who need surgery or, research into heart. But that doesn't really work in our capitalist system. If you want somebody to work for you, you have to pay them the money and you have to offer incentives to keep working there and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's an unfortunate side effect of the fact that, it's hard to afford anything, even if you've got a couple both working and living in the same house. And so people can't afford to do charity work as often, so yeah, it's a vicious cycle. Yeah. It's a vicious cycle.
Capitalism is the problem of evolutionary evil in monetary form.
I like it. We should clip that.
Any more?
No, we're all caught up.
Okay. So from that example that Peter Singer gives and all the little kind of tweakings that I did to it, we can say something like, if we have the ability to stop something very bad from happening without any kind of moral trade-off or, sacrificing anything of moral significance, then we have some kind of moral obligation to do it. And that's basically the first premise of his argument. If you pull it out of the paper, he doesn't explicitly state it, but that is basically his argument. So people suffering and dying because of a lack of food and shelter and medical care is a very bad thing. I mean, I suppose you could say it's not, but it seems like a pretty powerful intuition that these are bad things, just as the child drowning is a bad thing. So donating the money you spend on luxuries seems to be a way to solve this problem. Especially as you don't need those luxuries. You're not losing anything morally important. You're not sacrificing anything morally important. And there's nothing comparable between a new shoes and a child dying. So if all those three premises are true, a moral ought here is that any money you would spend on luxuries, just like the new shoes that you're going to lose, seems to be that you should give it to charity.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that Singer actually does live by this quite strongly.
He's one of the main proponents of effective altruism. People criticize him because I think he has his mother in a care home.
I think that there's a lot of criticisms of Singer. I've seen a lot of them around.
Yeah, but this is one of the criticisms they make of him for effective altruism, that there is luxuries that he has. But he gives pretty much all of his money away, apart from sustaining that, keeping his mother in a home, sustaining his home, making sure he's got enough food. He lives a pretty simple life, all things considered. Considering how much money he has, most of the money from his book sales goes to help the needy and the poor.
Yeah.
So he does live by this creed.
Yeah, he even won a big prize recently, I think, or I don't know what. He won a pretty big sum of money that he gave and gave that all away. So like he does seem to live by that. Also, I think it's probably worth pointing out that even if he didn't live by his own principles, right, that there would be like sort of an ad hom, right, but it wouldn't necessarily invalidate. Like it could be perfectly true that his argument is still true and correct, right? But it's just that he sort of is a bit of a hypocrite in a way, right? That would be more of an argument against him than his arguments, right? His arguments could be still perfectly fine, even if he is unable or doesn't really follow the conclusions.
Yeah, it's like a doctor telling you shouldn't smoke, even though
exactly.
What he's telling you is right. It's
Yeah.
he's just being hypocritical, like you say.
Yeah. Okay.
So those are the basic premises of the argument. Like I say, it caused a bit of a stink when it came out, and you can kind of see why. Because the argument is basically saying, you know how you bought that cup of coffee on your way to work? You were a cunt. It does, doesn't it? It's like, you're a really bad person for going to the cinema to watch the Batman last night. When you could have been giving that $20 and waiting for the Batman to come on TV. Though, in the stronger version of the argument, you shouldn't be having that TV.
Yeah.
You should be selling it and giving it to the poor. Because it's a luxury you don't necessarily need. But I think psychologically, if you think about ethics, there's the ought implies can. So if you're going to go stir crazy side in your house without your TV, then there's some psychological thing that'll stop you from giving it up. In other words, you can't give away that TV, but you can stop spending future money on it. That kind of thing. So there could be some leeway there, depending on how you look at it. Singer doesn't quite look at it that way. Basically, anything you need to spend so that you can earn more money to give to the poor to stop them starving isn't a luxury. So if you need a new suit so you can go to work because you need a suit for work, that's fine. You need new boots, that's fine. You need a $200 pair of high tops. That's not so fine, unless, you're a basketball player and you're advertising these shoes. But then the money you get paid for doing the advertising should go.
Goes to charity.
Yeah.
I was going to say with the TV, if part of your job is movie review or something like that, and that's how you earn your money, then obviously you've got more justification for having the TV. But yeah. Covered that off with a sort of high top example.
Yeah. I have to admit that I'm quite sort of my intuitions actually align, even like with stronger versions. They seem to align there as well, right?
Yeah.
Before, for example, there was this example about thinking about whether or not the shoes are you have to have them for work or not, right? But I think if you imagine the same scenario that from the very beginning, right, where you have like a child drowning in a puddle next to you, right? I don't think that whether or not you have, or whether or not the shoes that you would irreversibly damage, are for work or not should be a consideration in that instance, right? I think
not
you
if
should save
you've got
the
the old
child,
shoes.
That's it, right? So that's why I'm sort of like, maybe like I get that he's trying to sort of have this minimal version that everybody should be at least be able to get on board with, but I think my intuitions sort of go beyond that even. So yeah, this is quite powerful.
It's a powerful argument, isn't it? Yeah. And it's a very intuitive argument. But like I say, there are lots of papers, like lots of them, arguing against this. And if you read John Keek's paper, it starts with a tirade, right? A really angry tirade. And you can kind of tell it's touched a nerve because he says Peter Singer isn't arguing morality, he's moralizing, which is a slightly different thing. So it's putting something forward without any real good reason, and it's just getting on your high horse and acting superior because of your beliefs. But he isn't really doing that with this argument, as far as I'm concerned anyway, because he makes a pretty good case for that argument from the child drowning in the pond. There seems to be things where you can stretch that and you can sort of transpose that argument onto the argument that he's made and say, well, if the intuitions work in the pond example, why don't they work in this example? There's no actual functional difference between them.
Yeah.
So the first paper to release as a response to this came from Garrett Hardin. I think that's his name. Hang on. Sorry, I better double check. Let's face it, my memory's not good at the best of times. Yeah, Garrett Hardin. And it was called Lifeboat Ethics. Okay. And in undergrad, you'll probably read Hardin's Lifeboat Ethics and Peter Singer's paper together. And there are certain social sciences where you'll be doing this as well. And Hardin's argument is there's a few ideas in it. The first idea is that people look at the Earth as if it's a spaceship. So we're on bring this planet together, and we're on a spaceship, and
we lost you again.
Somebody
Dave.
just laughed.
Yeah, no, you're back. You're back.
Oh,
you're back.
Sorry. You were both still moving on my end, so I just figured it was okay. How far did you get?
No, I think we had it
the
all.
Planet.
It's just Yeah.
Yeah. That's it. But Hardin argues that it's not a spaceship; it's actually a lifeboat. We only have so many resources, and we have to have like a safety limit. So a lifeboat can safely carry 50 people, but at a push, it can carry 60 people. So in this example that Singer's giving, we should be looking at it more like a lifeboat example rather than this giant spaceship that we all share. So if we were to open our borders to these people and bring them in, it taxes our own reserves, it taxes our own economy. And if you think about a lifeboat, imagine you're in this lifeboat, you manage to get to a lifeboat, there's 50 people in it, but there's 100 people drowning outside. What do? You can't let them all in, because then the boat will capsize and everybody will be dead. You could bring in 10, but that would cause issues with safety, and you might also end up dead. And how do you pick those 10? Like, do you go by age? Do you go by skill set? Do you go by how much they could contribute to the economy afterwards? So those people who think that we should be helping these people drowning outside, what they should be doing is to give up their place for one of the people outside.
Okay.
Like swap places with them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
long?
he says,
For how long?
For what?
How long should they swap their places for?
For good.
For good. Right.
Yeah. Because, they're the ones saying we should be helping these people. Well, you should be helping them. You should be giving up your spot and allowing them the safety of your seat. And this is kind of a popular right-wing kind of argument these days, isn't it? We can't let people in because it'll tax our economy, they'll steal from us. it's not going to be particularly safe if we let them all in. But in this case, he's talking about how most affluent countries have organized it in such a way that they have a safety net that can be falled back on. So if we allow people in, that diminishes that safety net. And how many do you let in? Do you keep going until the safety net is gone? Well, then all it takes is one emergency, and you're in the same condition, and you brought them into the same conditions. And the question that he asks is, well, why haven't they set up safety nets and whatnot? So why is it up to the people who have had the forethought to set up a safety net to save the people who didn't have the forethought of setting up a safety net? That's his first criticism.
Okay. I have a few questions.
Go for it.
Go for it.
Like the first, it seems that this sort of train of thought is, I don't know if the right way to put it is that it ignores part of what Singer is arguing here. But like Singer is very explicitly, right, he seems to be arguing for like as you mentioned at the very beginning, that it's not really particularly useful to build the Sydney Opera House or something, right? That it doesn't like all of these things that are extra, right? Not really the things that you need to survive, right? Singer himself grants that, things that you need to work, you should keep and stuff like that, right? But when we talk about lifeboats, right, it seems kind of, I don't know, wrong.
There's a misanalogy there.
Yeah, there seems to be a misanalogy here, right? Because it's almost like you're starting to build stuff on this lifeboat, right? That doesn't really make it easier for this, or more probable that this lifeboat will survive and stuff like that. So that's sort of the first point that I'm noticing here that I think might be a bit.
I think that's a great point. And because there is no affluence on that lifeboat, there might be those 10 spots, but that's not really affluence as such. You probably should help those people on board, but there isn't really a lot you can do. It's not like spending £600 million on a Concorde, rather than giving it to them. There's a misanalogy going on here.
Also, like it's not like these things do. I mean, they don't contribute to building up a sort of safety net or something like that, right? Because that was the other sort of idea there, right? That we're building out a safety net so that we are able to increase the chances of should bad things happen, right, for the people that are already in the lifeboat, if you will. But it seems to me that at least part of this doesn't apply here, right, because it doesn't go towards building a safety net, right? So I think these would be my two first like sort of hot observations on the argument.
Great observations. I think he makes some reasonable points, but I don't think those points actually go against Singer's arguments. They're more arguments for why we should regulate what we do, rather than saying, well, this is why we shouldn't give money to the distant poor.
Yeah.
Yeah, does that make sense?
I mean, I could see how some of these arguments, most definitely, like considerations about whether or not I'm bringing an extra person on board, right, by increasing the risk of everybody dying. I think that's a very interesting idea. I think other philosophers have touched on this. Interestingly, in philosophy of religion, I'm talking in particular about Peter van Inwagen when he talks about theodicies, I believe, and how. I don't remember the exact context, right? But there was this analogy that he built that was very much like this, right? Where how much evil you allow is sort of like analogous to this sort of thing, right? Where you might allow for certain evils to happen, like someone drowning for the sake of saving someone, like or the majority of people and stuff like that. Right, that was sort of an attempt of a theodicy, which I don't think really works that well primarily because of the capabilities of God, but that's another story.
That's a different thing. Yeah.
It's a different thing. But it's not like this idea is new to me, but it's definitely very interesting. I just don't know how well it applies to, as you mentioned, Singer's argument.
Yeah, it doesn't really touch on it as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah, I don't think it's a successful rebuttal. So there's a couple more points that he makes, but one of the more interesting ones is the idea of overpopulation. And this is kind of what the Lifeboat Ethics is getting at.
Mm-hmm.
What he's saying is that in those poorer countries, the population continues to grow exponentially, like at a far faster rate than those in the Western countries. So they're overtaxing their resources. So what should be happening here isn't giving all our money to them, because that won't solve the problem. It'll solve the problem. It'll be like a bandage. It'll be like plugging a cork in a leaking casket. Eventually, the pressure is going to grow and pop that cork back out, and you'll have the same problem again. So what he says isn't that we should just be throwing all the money at this. What we should be doing is looking at the structural organizations and putting sort of sorry, the word's gone, but sort of you tell them that unless they work on these structural problems, unless they discuss contraception, unless they discuss population control, you're not going to give them the money. So basically, you hold them hostage with the money.
It's a condition.
That's it. Yeah. Condition. Sorry, brain went completely blank.
No worries.
Yeah. So what he says is, yes, sending money is fine, but it's not up to us to give all of our money away, like Singer says, because throwing money at it isn't going to solve the problem. What's going to solve the problem is actual restructuring of that society, restructuring of how that society thinks. So unless that comes along with it, you're going to have the problem with the lifeboat, where you can throw money at it and you can save a certain amount of people, but as long as the population keeps doubling, not enough people are going to be able to get onto the lifeboat. It should be kept so that people can have this lifeboat that they can safely get into and make sure that they're not overusing their resources.
Okay, I see. That does make sense. I think it sort of goes back to some of the things that we already mentioned previously, right? That it's not just about giving these things, but also being concerned with, the overall situation and making sure that the overall situation is such that you're also contributing to fixing the underlying issues, right? So you're not just keep fixing something that is eventually going to break and become unsustainable, even, right? So that kind of makes sense to me. But I'm also sometimes concerned, right? Because there's this open question in my mind when it comes to, like, it's fine if you're talking like systemically. I think that that's one argument, right, that you can make and look at this as a system, right, and sort of how to allocate resources properly and with some sufficient way to allocate resources properly and stuff like that, right? But then from a very different perspective, there's also this, how much are you willing to sacrifice in the now for the sake of something that is going to be stable in the future, right? Because after all, the people who are born now, right, they don't have any guilt for being born into the situation that they're born into, right? Like, it's not like they chose and that they're even responsible, right, for the choices of the parents and the society into which they are born, right? It's just a coincidence. So are you willing to sacrifice them in a way, right, in order to make sure that the situation is then stable for future generations? I don't know. These are, like, I think, interesting questions.
They definitely are.
Yeah.
And I completely agree. Because holding a child hostage you're basically holding a child hostage in that situation.
Yeah, right. Like it's like saying, I'm willing to kill or let this child die, which is this kind of the same to me, right? In order, like, for them to, for future children not to die, right? Like something like that. Which, I mean, as a sort of consequentialist utilitarian, it might make sense, right? But it's still something that's a bit dicey, right? Like you want to be.
Well, this is why I brought up the example of stepping on a child's head to save the child behind you, and letting the child drown so that you can save the child behind you.
Yeah, but it also goes into sort of a trolley problem in a way, right? Because at some point it's like, are you willing to just, step on a child's head if you want to put it this way, right? In order to save 5 children in the future, something like that, right?
Yeah.
So, it sort of turns into this.
And this is where I think something like John Rawls' veil of ignorance comes in. Because if we look at it through the veil of ignorance, we would want us to step in and save as many people as possible while doing the restructuring, rather than holding me hostage and letting me die because they won't restructure. And I think most rational people would agree. And I think that's why John Rawls' argument is useful in this situation, as well as being a very compelling argument.
Yeah. Maybe we should sort of explain briefly what the veil of ignorance is as an idea.
Sorry. I just expect everybody to know.
No. That's fine.
Sorry.
I'm aware, but I think it could be useful as an idea.
So the veil of ignorance is the idea that when you're planning policies, you're creating a government, you're, stuff like that, you're doing stuff that affects the population of your country.
Yeah.
You should be doing it as if you don't know who you are going to be in that country and that government. So it allows for rational self-interest, but it doesn't allow a sort of rational self-interest for you in particular.
Yeah.
Or your skin color, or your affluence, or anything like that. Yeah.
It's almost like a game, right? You're pretending that you're going to end up in this sort of scenario, but you don't know who you're going to be. You're going to exactly, right? And then you have to make sure that it's the world that you would want to live in, right? And theoretically, that should make sure that you're making sort of decisions that are fair. And I think that's actually quite powerful as an idea.
I do as well. It's one of my favorite arguments in philosophy, and I think it, when used in a whole bunch of things, like, I mean, if you think about the whole Roe versus Wade thing in America at the moment, and abortion being made illegal, sure, there's going to be a lot of people who will think, well, I'll never be put in that position.
Yeah.
But when you're behind that veil of ignorance, you could be the poor person who can't afford the child, and the child's going to suffer.
Yeah.
So what would you want available to you in that situation? And you would want that kind of thing to be available to you.
Yeah.
Especially if the baby, like some of them are going so far as if to say, even if the baby dies in the womb, you've still got to carry it to term.
Yeah.
Only a monster would argue that.
Really?
Yeah, that's one of the arguments. Yeah.
That is insane.
So a veil of ignorance would definitely stop something like that.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And so that's basically the crux of the main Lifeboat Ethics. There are other theses in it, but those are the two that most apply and the two that most people use. And John Keeke's argument is very similar. Like I say, it kind of argues that at the beginning it's very angry at Peter Singer, calls him moralizing, saying he doesn't know what he's talking about. And he makes a similar kind of argument where what we should be focusing on isn't saving the child. That's the wrong way to put it. Isn't just throwing money to keep these children alive, but it should be about rebuilding the structure, helping them to rebuild the structure. We should be dedicating government resources to that, as well as accepting charity, and using that charity money to go and stop those children starving. Now, another one of his arguments is a criticism of the first premise. Now, what he argues is that it doesn't seem as like obvious that we should stop somebody from dying. Imagine if the person in the pond was a mass murderer who just shot a couple of people and he was drowning. It doesn't seem so obvious to us now that we should be pulling that person out because, well, what's he just done? Justice is by his own stupidity.
Wait, you're getting interrupted.
Obviously, we should be pulling that person out. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, a bunch of interruptions there. We heard something about a mass murderer and whether or not we should pull him out of the
Yeah, well, that's what Keeks argues, that who's in the pond makes a difference to our intuition about whether we should pull them out and save them. So it doesn't seem quite so obvious that we have a moral obligation to save a person from drowning. I don't quite agree with that because I'm slightly more cosmopolitan. I don't think justice is served by letting them drown.
Yeah. No, I don't agree with that either, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, I suppose you could also bring it back to things like the trolley problem. I mean, if you in the standard trolley problem, in general, most people would choose to save the 5 people. But if you start adding things onto it, like what the people are, or what the people are going to go and do, you might change how your general intuition there. So I understand his point. It's not exactly the same one. I mean, I can understand having a bit more hesitance to save someone that's a mass murderer, but it's not your job. It's not your duty to let them die. It's at the end of the day, we have the obligations that we have to each other to do our best to look after each other, and maybe this mass murderer could be rehabilitated in prison and become, go on to do something good. Don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. It's another example he uses is what happens if you pull the person out and they go on to kill 10 people in a mass shooting? Should you have saved that person? I don't think those actually matter to Singer's argument because he's not talking about having knowledge of who's drowning in the pond. It shouldn't really matter. If there's a guy who's a gangster that's starving to death across the world, we still have a moral obligation to save him. We might have to arrest him once he gets better, put him in jail, give him some justice. But as long as he's starving, I mean, could that be the reason that he was committing those crimes? He was starving. He needed to eat. So he stole from the local shopping mall. I don't think his argument works quite as well as he intended. But like I say, when you read the paper, you can read he's very angry writing this. Yeah, it's sort of like, he's just very angry because, I mean, if you think about it, this argument has just told him, an Ivy League professor who's probably pretty affluent, that he's a cunt for owning a nice TV and a nice car. So, like I say, it made people kind of angry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
but I think, like, if you're willing to go into the specifics, right, of the people, and whether or not, like, what happens if you save and then whatever. I mean, by that logic, that seems to be a pretty good sort of way to defeat pretty much any argument for saving anyone, right? Because, like, you can make this type of observation for anything, in my opinion, right? You could make even the most obvious situation, right, where it appears to you obvious that you should save the person, right? And like, maybe there's a house on fire, right? And there's someone screaming, "Help me!" right? And what if I save him and then he goes and presses the kill everything button and the world explodes, right? I mean, we can't know for sure, so I guess we'll let him. Like, that type of sort of thing seems very weak to me.
It does. Situation. Your moral responsibility ends at the saving of a life rather than at what he does after you save his life.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no reason that you shouldn't call an ambulance for a biker who's fallen off his bike because he's covered in tattoos and you think he takes drugs and smuggles drugs and he's a bad person. You're a bad person for not saving their lives. So it doesn't seem to matter who that person than it is when you dig deep down into the actual argument, look at the
Yeah.
intuitions.
Yeah, but also it seems that even if these things would matter, right? Like if you take it simpliciter, right? Like without any further observation, right? Just know that there's a person that is about to die and starving, right? Like you have an obligation towards that, right? And then of course we can discuss specifics, right? We can say, oh, what happens if this and that, right? Like then the things might change, right? But as a rule, in terms of what we know about the situation, which is pretty general, I think it's very hard to argue against it. And if you take, the possibility of specifics that contradict this as sort of a good reason to contradict the entire sort of thing, that just doesn't work.
It fails for me as well.
Yeah, it fails for me as well.
So that was basically Keek's argument. Sorry, I'm rushing through these. I know it's
no, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah. So now we have, I think his name's Marcock. Let me just double check. Yeah, Marcock. He makes an argument based on the pond analogy and why the pond analogy fails to set up Singer's argument. And why it's kind of self-defeating. Paper's called "Draining the Swamp," I think, or "Draining Singer's Swamp."
Where there are many of them, or something like that. Is that the one?
Yeah. There's three examples of ponds. They all seem kind of the same. But essentially, his argument is that, well, if you're going to save the child in the pond, there are other children out there who are suffering. So by stopping and saving the child in the pond, instead of going straight to a charity and offering to volunteer overseas, you are saving the child you are sacrificing something of moral comparability, because you're allowing those children across the world to die without going to save them. And if proximity doesn't matter, you should be getting on the plane, because proximity doesn't count. So you should be overlooking this child in order to save the greater amount of children.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I'm confused about what the exact argument here is.
Okay. So Singer argues that we should be doing things. We should be giving things up if they're not of moral comparison.
Yeah.
So 2 children drowning in the pond next to it is a greater moral kind of comparability than one child drowning.
Yeah.
So if there's a child drowning in that pond and there's 2 children drowning in the next pond and you can only save one of them, you should be going to the pond with 2 people in it.
Yeah. Okay.
Because proximity doesn't matter. The amount of people around there doesn't matter. So you should be overlooking that child and going for the one with the greatest moral kind of problem.
Yeah.
Now, if proximity doesn't matter, and you can get on a plane and go and save children across the world who are starving,
instead of paying a charity to save one.
Yeah. And instead of saving the child in the pond, you should be getting on that plane and going over and saving those starving children.
Okay. So on my way to the airport, if I see a child in a pond, I should not save him.
You should not save him.
I'm on my way to
if you're going to miss your flight. Yeah.
I see what the argument is.
But if you're not going to miss your flight, I mean, I know proximity doesn't matter like big picture, but I think it does still matter small picture. If you can save a life that's right in front of you,
Yeah, this is an examples where, what should you be doing? You should be going for the greatest, because consequentialism,
I agree with that side of it. I just think that he's missing the point. It's not that proximity doesn't matter completely. There are certain things to it. Like if you were talking about, there was a child and it was too far away and there was no way that you were going to save it, you still have the obligation to perhaps try. Let's say there's no one else around, you're the only person. You might have the obligation to perhaps try, but actually you're not going to get there in time to save that child. But if it was a case of, and let's say it was two really far away, you're not going to get to, and there's one next to you, again, the one that you can save is probably better for you to go for than trying to get to the two that you're not going to save, if you know you're not going to save them. So with the fact that you've got to travel around the world and all of that, if there's one person in front of you that you can save that might delay your trip by a few minutes, you're probably right doing that. You should just, obviously, I agree what you're saying, you should make the effort to go and do more elsewhere in the world, if that's feasible, though. Because that's the other side. I mean, if you're going to go around the world, but actually in doing so, you're going to lose your livelihood, you're not going to be in a position where you can help them out anymore. So it's not exactly self-defeating. You'd be in a better position, say, from England or America or whatever, to help out a poorer country than some of the things you could do working in those poorer countries. There are things that you could obviously do, volunteering to build homes and all of that. But all the same, what if you have other responsibilities as well, like your family that need you to look after them and so on? I think it's a bit more complex than either side is really making out.
But Singer's argument argues that proximity doesn't matter, the number of people doesn't matter, and you should be giving up everything to save the lives of the starving children. So, in the case of 1 million starving children and one child drowning in the pond, you should be giving up everything that isn't of moral equivalence to save those 1 million children. And one child drowning isn't a moral equivalence compared to 1 million people. So if it's necessary to you should be doing. If it's necessary to miss saving that child, then so be it. Which, yeah.
I think.
But sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm still processing.
I was just going to say, I think one thing that this kind of, it isn't the intent of the argument, but I think one thing you could say from this argument is that what it shows is,
you cut off a bit, but I think we heard most of what you were saying, so I think, at least I did. I don't know if Joe did as well.
I was just saying one thing that the argument's not making, but I'm going to use at the minute. I'm going to use this argument to make it. What this argument kind of shows is that, okay, you have 600,000 homeless people. They're not dying. And so if you should be overlooking the lesser thing, then the money that you're giving to them, give them only what they need and send the rest overseas because, there's no moral equivalence there. That same argument could be used to argue for Peter's case that we should be sending as much money overseas rather than spending it all here on homeless people who need help but aren't going to die. So you give them enough, and the reserves that are left over, send over there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I also maybe this is, I don't know how nitpicky this is, but I wonder how many of the factors in this thought experiment are controlled, right? Because, for instance, you could say, well, of course, right? Like if you suppose that we go to the example of buying new shoes, right? Or buying like a cup of coffee or something, right? Like you could buy a cup of coffee or send the $5, to save a child or something, right? That would be one sort of scenario, right? But if you're now involving that, you could do instead of that you could just travel, right, to somewhere where you can save more people, stuff like that, right? That is going to presumably involve more resources in terms of like just monetary resources purely, like if you look at that, right? So I wonder how that converts, right? Like would investing those monetary resources that I would need to afford traveling around the world and saving these people, like would that not be better? Maybe it would be better to invest that directly into a charity, right? And maybe I could save more people in that way, right? Like, for example, that sort of could be a variable that needs to be controlled in a way. But then also, like, this, I don't know if this is set up as a reductio, in the sense that, you know, you should be going around the world saving children, but that's clearly not what you should be doing, right? So the whole thing is wrong. I don't know if that's the setup, right?
Because it's something like that, yeah.
Because if it's not, right, it's just making Peter Singer's case even stronger. Right? In a way,
I agree.
Right, so like if that's not the latter portion of this sort of argument, then I don't see how this is a rebuttal. It's rather sort of a build-up of the whole thing. In a way.
That's how I saw it. Most people don't see it that way. They take it as, yes, under consequentialism, they should be ignoring that child because they're creating a greater, they're reducing a greater amount of suffering. And but if you think about that, say, $1,000 that they were going to spend on the plane ticket over there, like you said, they could donate that to charity. Now, them going over there to help just on their own isn't going to be able to do as much good as a charity that already has a framework set up in that.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah. So I don't think the argument quite makes what he was arguing. I mean, it's a good argument, and it gives reason to think about. It gives reason to think about Peter Singer's argument. But I think when you actually break it down, it makes Peter Singer's argument stronger.
Yeah. Unless you think that that's a reductio, and I could see how someone might get that as a reductio, right, and think like, oh, that's clearly absurd, right? So the whole thing must be wrong, right? It's that would follow then. But I'm trying to think what the argument would be to make, like, other than intuition, I suppose, that that is sort of what you shouldn't be doing, or that's clearly absurd. And I'm not finding a strong.
I'm kind of briefing over the argument. It's like a 20-page argument. But I'm just going with, the actual main thesis of the argument.
Yeah.
I can send you the papers if you want to read them.
Yeah, I'd love to read them.
Yeah. Okay. So we've been on an hour and a half. I'll try to finish soon. So one of the problems as well that I see with these things as an attack on Peter Singer's argument is that they're approaching Singer's argument as if it's a consequentialist argument, because Peter Singer is a consequentialist. Now, if you look at the actual argument itself, you can see that Peter Singer's done something quite clever here. He's not actually arguing in a consequentialist form. He's arguing in a value pluralist form, that we have certain deontological duties that can't be broken, and saving the child is an actual deontological duty rather than a consequentialist principle.
Okay. So then people who
argue strictly on a consequentialist form like that, you should be going over and saving all those. Well, no, because then you're neglecting the idea that you have a duty to save that child on the way to the plane.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. But also, like, I suppose then that kind of breaks all those people who would maybe be tempted to say, well, but I'm not a consequentialist, so that doesn't apply to me. Because if it's not built on the presumption of consequentialism, then that doesn't seem to, do much for you. If you just say, oh, I'm not consequentialist, I don't believe consequentialism is true.
Yeah, there's those deontological duties in it. So if you're deontological, you should be accepting the argument as well. Yeah, and if you're a value pluralist, virtue ethicist,
no matter you. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. I don't want to.
I was just going to say, all those are actually included in Peter Singer's argument.
Yeah.
I think that's what makes it such a strong argument, and such a compelling argument, because parts of it speak to almost every moral theory that people hold, at least in some part.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to matter. Your meta ethics doesn't seem to matter when your intuitions are so strong on the cases that he presents, right? And I think, like, it's almost this is sort of like a bit the weird thing in ethics, right? That we seem to argue meta ethics based on our intuitions, right? in a way, right? So we evaluate metaethics based on intuitions, and then we sort of build up to metaethics, and then we use that to build down to address cases, right? Then, so in a way, right? If you say, oh, but my metaethics doesn't say that saving a drowning child is what you should be doing, right? Then you probably should reconsider your metaethics in a way, because it's one of those like basic things, right? That if you don't agree with that, right, there's definitely something wrong with your system, at least like from an intuition perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could probably say here something like, well, if all morality is subjective, then I have no duties to that child. As long as I think not saving the child is good, then not saving the child is good. But if you go back to something that T.M. Scanlon once argued, that ethics may not necessarily be a system of oughts. It might not be in the sort of moral realism thing, but even in the subjective world of ethics, ethics are about defending our actions to other people and making other people see those actions as acceptable. Now, if you were to turn around and say, well, I just don't believe I should have saved the child, you're not really defending that position, and most people are still going to call you a bit of a psychopath.
Yeah. And I think like even in a subjective sense, right, that there's a surprising amount, I think, actually, that you can retain in terms of the value judgments that you can make, and even the judgments of other people and stuff like that, right? Like a lot of that can be retained even in the subjective framework. I'm not exactly sure how much of that can be retained if you're a moral subjectivist, but I think a lot of that can be sort of translated or kept.
It just changes what the language means, really. You can still make the same judgments, but what it actually means is something different. So in a purely subjectivist framework, as in like moral subjectivism, and if that was the case, and you thought it was moral to stamp on children's heads, and I was to say, no, I think it's immoral for you to do that, what I'm actually saying is, I don't like that it's moral for you to do that.
Yeah, you'd say that I don't find it preferable, right? But then at some point it becomes a question of if it becomes like Dave mentioned, right? Like part of it is how do you defend how do you defend yourself even, right, in certain situations? Because at some point consistency is going to matter, even if you're a subjectivist, right? So if in some situation let's say that you're in a pub or something, right? And this is a very basic example, and it's not particularly morally sort of strong, right? But let's say that you're not going to tip someone, right? You're not going to tip them, right?
Why not?
Yeah, because it's not, you don't think that's your obligation. You don't have a preference towards that, right? And that's sort of from your subjective perspective, not something that you should have done, right? But then let's say that you work that you happen to work as someone that someone as a waiter, let's say in a pub, right? And then someone doesn't tip you, right? You probably are not going to be happy with that, right? Because you're going to be that is in your interest, right? You're going to say subjectively that you feel like you should have been tipped, right? That person should have tipped you, right? But then you're in this weird situation where you didn't tip, but you feel like you should have been the one who got the tip, right? And so at this point, it becomes an issue as a subjectivist, right? For you to argue that it, to convince these other people that you should have gotten the money while you didn't do the same, right? So in this sort of, I think that is sort of part of what makes even moral subjectivism, right, affected by these sorts of arguments and stuff, that you still have to have these sort of internal consistency. You have to have some sort of way to reason in these cases, right? And even in your own self-interest, right? You have to sort of keep this consistency. And again, right? Like you can say that subjectively, it's fine. You don't feel like it's a problem for you to smash these babies' heads or something, right? But it also becomes a problem in a broader society where a lot of people are, you're going to feel subjectively the opposite, right? And you might find yourself in a situation where you feel the opposite because it's your kids, right? But then how do you sort of stop these other people from doing what you did, right? And then it ends up in the same types of situation, right? So it becomes sort of a balancing act at some point, where even if you're sort of purely subjectivist, right, you have to sort of establish these types of frameworks, right, about what is acceptable and what is not. And I think a lot of what we discuss and a lot of what people that are more objectivist care about can be established in this sort of distributed sort of subjectivist framework, if you will, as well. I'm not sure if everything can be, because there are always these cases where you might say, oh, I don't care about tipping because I subjectively didn't feel like this, and that you're never going to work in a pub or something, right? And then how does it affect you, right? You're not really losing much, right? So are you really doing something? There seem to be these cases, these edge cases where you can get away with it in a way, right? So there's a lot to discuss there, but I think I'm sort of getting off topic a bit in terms of subjectivism.
No, I agree with what you say there. And if you think about what a lot of, at least in the atheist and skeptic community, what they argue is that morals are subjective. They're just our way of navigating a society and keeping it kind of cohesive. In a society where tipping is normal and you decide, well, I don't think it's moral to tip, you're going to be kind of outcast and you're going to kind of break that cohesion. And most people just won't want to be around you, because when you're you're at a restaurant and everybody throws in that $5 and you go, fuck it, I don't tip. Yeah. They're not going to bring you out to a meal again. And as we're social species and we care about our groups, we're going to feel as if we should begin tipping.
Yeah, because there are going to be stuff people that you care about, right? Like all these decisions like ripple out much wider than you might anticipate, right? Because there are going to be people that you care about, presumably, right? And those might have people that they care about, and that, if they then don't get the tip, it affects them, which in turn affects you, right? Like it's a much broader system. So I think it could be argued that, it is in your best interest to sort of be within these sorts of boundaries, right? But I also think that there are these edge cases, as I mentioned, where there's going to be something that you get a huge benefit, right, by doing something that breaks these sorts of things, right? But because of how huge this benefit is, it's going to be very hard for you to argue that it is in your self-interest to not break that because of just purely how big that sort of bump is in benefit, right? So, yeah, there are sort of things to discuss there. But I think again, a lot can be achieved on a subjectivist framework.
I feel like you just called Jeff Bezos out.
Probably. Probably. I do think that a lot of that happens actually because of these sorts of in these scenarios where doing something that is considered that just gives you this boost that you're like, okay, maybe you don't even realize it, right? Like I think we tend to see these things and pick them out really strongly, right? But I think we sort of underestimate how natural these things feel in the moment, how little really resistance there is. It's not like, oh, I have a big evil plan and I'm going to do this. In most cases, I think, right? Even very evil things don't happen with like, I'm the evil guy that is going to do this evil thing, right? I'm going to profit off of this, right? It is almost scary how natural these things are actually, I think, and how just commonly they can happen without you even realizing it. So, yeah.
Okay, so that was basically the crux of Singer's argument and paper, and in a very brief form, I guess. I hope I went into enough detail to actually.
That was absolutely fantastic. Yeah.
So perhaps a little bit about effective altruism, which is the movement that Singer is part of and pretty much leads, and it's formed from this paper. So over time, Singer has kind of mellowed on this. He's saying we shouldn't be giving everything away. But there is a certain amount that we ought to be giving away because we don't particularly need those pair of shoes. So there should be some kind of thing, some kind of duty to give this money away. Oop, the background disappeared.
It did. That's weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
What background?
The background on Restream. It's still on YouTube. Yeah. And he's saying that the richer you are, the more morally obligated you are.
Background is back.
Yeah. Joe broke it. This time it's Joe's fault.
I wasn't even looking at Restream at the time. I was in a completely different window.
Yeah,
It's still your fault.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
Yeah.
look, who's here? Who's here?
Nobody but
Hashtag
you.
Philip's fault.
You're a solipsist and we only exist in your mind. So therefore,
shit.
everything we
Everything's
do
my
is
Philip's
your
fault is your fault, actually.
Oh.
Yep.
I think, yeah. I'm just a figment of your imagination. You're accusing yourself.
So, yeah, Singer argues that, okay, maybe he made too strong of an argument. He still stands by the argument. He still thinks he should be doing, but he realized that this might be psychologically incompatible. And I've frozen again, haven't I?
No, you came back. I think we got it. I think we got
Okay.
it in the end.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. He says it's not really psychologically compatible with most people. So in effective altruism, the rich should be giving lots and lots away. We should be enjoying our lives. We should still be giving money away when we can. So if you go into a shop and you get 20 pence change, drop that in a charity box. If you don't necessarily need a new pair of trousers, don't buy them. Use that money for better means. But if buying the trousers will improve your life to some extent, perhaps buy them. And that's only if you're on the lower end of the pay scale. On the greater end of the pay scale, he thinks that people earning millions and millions should be giving at least 10% of their money away. At all times. Yeah, because for you and me, £10, or for all three of us, £10 is a lot of money. Especially for somebody like me who's a student who doesn't get a lot of money. Me giving £10 to charity is the equivalent of a rich person, like we said at the beginning, is the equivalent of a rich person giving £1 million. So if they're on $3 billion a year, they should be giving at least 300 million away. Because that 300 million could save a lot of lives. And for them, it's a new yacht or a new private plane, which they don't need because,
They've already got 20.
Yeah. Look at Jerry Seinfeld, who has a multi-story car park full of classic cars that he owns. He owns the building, he owns the cars. They were all worth billions of dollars when put together. He should be selling those and giving that money to the poor because he doesn't need them. They're there for show. I can't say much because I've got arcade cabinets on my shelf and stuff like that. But there's a difference between a £10 electronic toy and a $3 million car. That £10 wouldn't have done much, but the $3 million that he paid for the car would have done a lot.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Like, it seems pretty intuitive to me that the whole argument is going to scale. The more of excess wealth you have, the more it's going to affect you as a person, right? Like, that seems perfectly that seems just to straight up follow from the initial argument that Singer made. So I'm not in the least surprised that this is sort of like a natural conclusion.
And so another part of effective altruism, and this has been added on now to Peter Singer's original argument, and this is the argument I mentioned earlier, that we should be doing our best to make sure that any money we give is used effectively. And this is something that Thomas Pogge goes into in great detail, along with some other political arguments based off of effective altruism.
Yeah.
So
that seems sensible.
So basically, that's everything rushed out very quickly. That was basically the paper that I wrote and handed in, and the ideas in it, and the ideas in the papers that responded to Singer and Singer's papers. hopefully, it was at least interesting, and
No, it was.
people
Thank you.
understand now.
No, this was absolutely really interesting. Like I enjoyed this a lot. But was your paper like responding to Singer in a way, or was this an overview of
the
Singer's
question was
position?
something like, is Peter Singer's argument in Famine, Affluence, and Morality effective? And then you have to sort of gather all the things together and look at Singer's argument, look at the arguments against it, and defend Singer.
So it was an overview of the entire sort of
yeah.
dialectic surrounding that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, this is very interesting.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for that, Dave. Is there anyone out there who's got any questions that they'd like to ask us? I mean, there was a comment earlier from Lone Wolf that was a little bit off topic, so I haven't included it until now. But there's one that's just popped in. Oh no, it's just me posting a llama. So where are we going? I'm trying to scroll up to where I found those messages earlier. Okay. So this he brought up something that I actually saw a couple of other people questioning on Twitter the other day, so what he said was someone was asking if we could make abortions legal again by forming a church with a doctrine supporting abortion and making the abortion process a religious right. And with their whole religious freedom side of things,
I think the Satanic Temple actually is.
I was just going to say that
something like that. Yeah. Pretty sure they have something precisely along these lines. Yes.
But then you're also dealing with a bunch of Christian nationalists who don't think that religious freedom is anything but Christianity.
No, you're right. So everyone should be free to practice Christianity.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're back now.
Yeah. So for them, religious freedom isn't allowing the Satanic Temple to have abortions. Religious freedom is the ability to do what the Christian God says you're allowed to do.
Yeah, they don't get it right.
Yeah. They don't go by the Constitution. They go by their belief in what the Constitution says.
Yeah. But I do I think what the Satanic Temple is doing is absolutely hilarious in a way, and quite like an interesting approach. But I don't think it's a very good idea to let sort of this loophole exist in general, right? Like, because you can quite easily imagine another sort of religion that does other things that maybe we would consider to be very immoral, right? But just because it's a religious ritual, it doesn't get a pass, right? In my mind. So
you can think of even like things like circumcision,
Yeah, but let's say that someone comes up, I don't know, we sacrifice the firstborn in our community, right? And that's our religious ritual, right? That obviously shouldn't get a pass because it's a religious ritual, right? It's not like a freedom of religion type thing.
It could also be turned around by the Christians who say that bombing an abortion clinic is part of their religious freedom because they're doing what God says, they're defending the unborn. So then they have a religious loophole to bomb abortion clinics and assassinate abortion doctors.
Let's organize another crusade, literally. And I mean, it's a religious ritual, so I mean, I suppose we let that go, right? Like, that's why I'm sort of like, I don't particularly like that's entire sort of thought.
No, it's a great idea, but one that you have to tread very carefully with.
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking the other day, Dave, weren't we, saying that we'd like to cover off not necessarily exactly the Roe v. Wade thing, but maybe the roles of religion and churches and things like that in the governing bodies of countries, and we'd love to have a conversation about that in the future. But it's obviously a really hot topic at the moment. There's going to be a lot of emotion. There always will be about this topic anyway. But right now we just sort of, let the dust settle a little bit before we have those conversations. Wolf also says Rastafarians got away with utilizing weed for a while on that excuse, but they had to argue out in court and still risk arrest. That's interesting, and I imagine that they probably no longer can get away with that as an excuse unless they're in one of the states where it's legal, where they don't need it.
Yeah. But the Satanic Temple has actually a pretty long history of doing this type, like using this the religious protections against its Christians.
Trolling with the purpose.
Yeah, it's actually quite beautiful in many ways, right? Like I think there is a Satan's children club, like after school children club or something, where they have like Satan picture coloring books and stuff, and that they use with and they argue that they should be allowed to have this sort of little Satan club, right? Because if the Christians are allowed to have these sorts of the Jesus club or whatever in schools, then they should be able to have that club as well for the people who want that, right? So and there's this it's a very clever game that they're playing, and I quite enjoy sometimes to see the results and yeah.
They do the same sort of thing with, when there's public religious symbols, they'll put up like a Baphomet statue and stuff like that.
I've seen that too. Yeah.
I think it makes a good point, to actually say you want everyone to have religious freedom. Well, this is what religious freedom is. And actually what you don't want is religious freedom. You want everything to be your way and everybody to accept it your way. But you're saying it's freedom, and you're contradicting yourself with what you want. And I think it's a good way of pointing out hypocrisy. And it's needed in certain places. I don't think that over here it's really one of those things that would be necessary, maybe in certain circumstances, but not necessarily on a religious front. I think maybe more on a political side, if we had something equivalent to that.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I think. I mean, it's not quite the same, but it echoes the idea of the veil of ignorance in a way, right? Where you don't know, you have to make decisions without knowing where you're going to end up, right? And so if you make a certain decision about that you should be allowed to have after school sort of activities that you organize based on religion, right? Then the Satanic Temple is there to remind you that the pretty picture that you have in your head probably is not the only thing that is going to result from that, right? And so you should really maybe think about it with care, essentially, right? So I think that's quite like flashy and very visible reminder of this sort of thing. And as you said, Joe, I think it is useful practice and something that would be useful to other areas, I think, as well. We sort of like this visual reminder that maybe the thing that you have in mind can have this sort of other consequence, so that you can make better policies and understand the situation better.
He also makes one more point on this, saying most people don't even realize that Satanists are not devil worshippers; they're just activists. And this is true. The Satanic Temple and the Satanic Church, or Church of Satan, should I say? Sorry. Neither of them believe in the literal devil. They are both doing it to sort of troll Christians. And maybe they could have chosen a more tactful name, but that's not what they're going for, and that's not what's really needed. So I could provide, a number of critiques as to why I think that perhaps they could have done it a different way, but in their situation, it's probably the most effective way to get the message across. But yeah, I mean, it's the same thing though. So many Christians will say all atheists are devil worshippers as well, and you're not even identifying as being Church of Satan. Unfortunately, it's just a way of othering people and making out people that they're evil or moral monsters, to bring us back on topic of morality tonight.
I'm not sure. Like, I'm 100% sure that the Satanic Temple is not a religion. Like, it's not. At best, it's a secular religion. I think they like to think of themselves as a secular religion. They're definitely not believing in anything supernatural. In fact, if you go and read their tenets, right, they're definitely, like, as far as possible from that as it could be, but I'm not sure. Like I'm pretty sure that there exists sort of theistic and non-theistic supernaturalists, sort of devil worshippers, right? Like Satanists. And I'm not sure exactly if that's the Church of Satan, right? But the whole Leval thing, I think it's Leval, right? Like Satanism, that whole thing, that they did actually believe in the supernatural. They
Church
had
of Satan
rituals.
believed in magic, even though they didn't believe.
Okay.
People like Aleister Crowley were actually devil worshippers in the sense that they believed the devil exists and gave them power. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are there is a portion of Satanists, right, that definitely do believe in the supernatural, at least in the supernatural, right? Some of them actually believe,
especially historically. I think less and less so in the modern era.
Yeah, that's the point I was about to make, right? Like nowadays, I think if someone calls themselves a Satanist, I think there's a good chance that they don't believe, that they're just essentially just trolling, right? That they're sort of the Satanic Temple type Satanist, where they just atheists essentially, with a bit of a colorful activist veneer on top of that.
Yeah, that's why most metalheads in the 80s used to, kind of be like, Satan, Satan, Satan. Not because they believed in him, but because it kind of spat in the face of the social norms.
Yeah. I think there's part of that too. And I can kind of get it. It's probably very fun.
It is, as somebody that used to do it in the 80s when I was into metal, yeah.
So, if there's no more questions from the chat, did you guys have anything you wanted to cover off or talk about before we wind down?
Nothing that I can think of. I think I covered pretty much most things that I wanted to cover. So,
what about you, Philip?
No, I think I don't have anything more to add. I think this was really, really good. I loved being part of the conversation, and this was something that I wanted to do for a long, long time, the sort of ethics of charity, and I think it was very productive. I loved it.
Well, Luke's supposed to be doing his own Ethics of Charity stream that we're going to be a part of, but I thought this might be a nice kind of start getting background knowledge on some of the ideas surrounding Ethics of Charity. I'll start putting together one on Thomas Pogue's ideas as well.
Yeah.
Like, I'll if we don't do it for a couple of weeks, I can put together a slideshow and all that. That's much easier for me.
Yeah. Well, I did want to say we're planning short term to cut down the live streams for the SciPhi short term to one a week, so that Dave and I can work on some more in-depth stuff, doing some more scripts, doing some more little videos as well. I want to get some more SciPhi shorts out, and I've got a few other ideas that I want to do. So we'll be cutting down to one a week. I don't know what day we'll necessarily keep, but at the moment it's going to be Tuesdays, and obviously there's still going to be the Psych stream every other Monday. So and Luke is currently going through the Dark Triad. So if you didn't catch it on Monday, he did Psychopathy, which is his first episode. I was late to the game on that one, but I managed to catch up. Definitely worth a watch. So check that out as well. And yeah, thank you absolutely everybody who has been in the chat tonight and joined in with us. It's always great having you there. And obviously to you, Philip, and you, Dave, for your attendance, participation, and all of your knowledge, Dave.
Yeah, cheers to both of you. It was a really enjoyable and fascinating discussion. Just exactly the kind I enjoy.
Awesome. Yeah, this is great. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Well, that's it from us, and we will catch you next Tuesday. Hopefully you're having yourself a good one.